So Disability Innovation Live. So these sessions are the Global Disability Innovations Hub monthly webinar series, and they're very much focused around sharing knowledge and experiences in disability innovation, but also really looking at the stories behind the innovations and the people behind the products. So getting in a little bit more depth around some of our work and our partners programs. It's very much an informal space, so for ideas and reflections, and we really welcome your feedback and, as I said, your input from your questions and even from your own experiences and stories as well. So just to give you a bit of an overview of who we are, the Global Disability Innovation Hub is a research and practice centre driving disability innovation for a fairer world. We were born out of the legacy of the London 2012 Paralympic Games, and we are both a community interest company, but also an academic research centre as part of UCL. We work across 33 different countries, and we're aiming to reach 15 million people by 2022. So we've got a global panel joining us today for the session. So I'll just briefly introduce them so you've got an idea who's coming up, but I'll leave each individual panelist to introduce themselves in a bit more detail and the areas that they work in. So we're going to be hearing from Ian McKinnon, who's one of the founders of the GDI Hub and also leads all our inclusive design work. From Michaela, again from the GDI Hub. From Peter Carr, who's done all sorts, so I shall leave Peter to introduce himself in a bit more detail. And we have Tamaru and Nimir Ocha, who are based in Mongolia. We also have Nina from Indonesia as well. So a really broad perspective of lots of different experiences and knowledge around inclusive design globally. So I'm going to start with handing across to Ian McKinnon, who's going to give us a bit more of an introduction into today's session.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you so much. Yeah, so welcome everyone. I am Ian. I lead the inclusive design work for GDI Hub. And so this introduction sets out what inclusive design means to us, what it means to GDI Hub, why it matters. And I'll also introduce our international work to you. So the image you can see is on screen is me with the Built Environment Access panel on Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in East London. Now, I wanted to start with, I'm sometimes asked, as we all are, what is it you do for a living? And to be honest, it's a question I often try and avoid because I feel like I've got quite a lot of explaining to do with that. It's not quite as simple as saying, oh, I'm a plumber or I'm a lawyer. And my current stock response is to say that I work on inclusive design, followed very quickly to preempt the inevitable follow-up question of, well, what does that mean? I make sure designers think about disabled people and older people when they design things. And I've found that most people tend to get that. You know, they usually respond by kind of nodding their head and saying, oh, that's really interesting. You know, maybe they're just being kind, I'm not sure, but people tend to kind of understand that. And for us, inclusive design is about people. And quite simply, it puts end users, and that includes all of us with all of our differences and all of our diversity, at the forefront of the minds of the decision makers, responsible for how something ends up being the way that it does. Now that's the same approach and mindset and kind of methodology for a new building as a website or a new car design or the way you serve a cup of coffee. But our emphasis is on the built environment, the world around us, and how can we shape that? So why does it matter? Next slide, please, Louise. This slide shows images of some inclusive design interventions that we've made on the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in Stratford in East London. So why does it matter? So this is a key question. And in my mind, it's the first step in delivering and implementing inclusive design. I think you have to ask, do you and your stakeholders really know why inclusive design is important? Do they understand the rationale? Do they appreciate the wider benefits? Do they realize that it can support them too? And in my experience, the answer to many of these questions is often no. And that's why we also focus on inclusive design education and training, as we recognize that long term, those responsible designers and decision makers need to be making informed and inclusive choices of their own without relying on interventions from so-called experts. It also matters if you care about your end user experience. For us, good inclusive design delivers equally positive user experiences for all end users, regardless of ability or support need. It delivers intuitive and more elegant solutions that work better. And this in turn helps eliminate the need for future alterations, add-ons, operational support, mitigation, and compensation. You also just create places where more people actually want to be, and not many businesses can argue against that. I'd like to go into the next slide, please, which is about setting our work in the global context. We're now working internationally, but my personal experience is very much rooted in the United Kingdom, the UK. I was the inclusive design champion for Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, and so was very focused on just East London for 8 years as part of the London 2012 Paralympic Games legacy. However, I was very privileged in that position, as a lot of hard work had already been done, culminating in the creation of that role. High-level commitments were in place, a structure for delivery was in place, legislation was in place, regulations were in place, and I already had the foundations for good policy and guidance to build on. I even had a ready-made access panel of local disabled people and experts to guide me. So now, 8 years on, working on global programs, GDI Hub is harnessing that experience and that knowledge from East London to help support and guide other cities around the world, particularly in low and middle income settings, to not only establish inclusive design frameworks of their own, but also how to implement them. Now, part of this work is our research on our UK aid-funded 80-20-30 programme. As you can see in the slide, I'll read it out, 80-20-30 tests what works to improve access to life-changing assistive technology for all. It's a £20 million programme over 5 years to support solutions to scale. It will reach 9 million people directly and 6 million people indirectly, driving a lifetime of potential, and it's operational in 15 countries across Africa and Asia. We have a sub-programme called Inclusive Infrastructure as part of 80-20-30, and our lead researcher, Michaela Patrick, will introduce that work to you later on, along with 2 of our in-country delivery partners. So I hope that helps set the scene for what we'll be discussing over the next 50 minutes or so, and I look forward to all your questions and comments as we go. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ian. I mean, that was a really fantastic introduction and an overview of what inclusive design is and why it matters. So we're now going to be moving on to hearing from Peter Carr. So Peter, I shall hand across to you and let you introduce yourself and a little bit about your experience and your area of knowledge.
Thank you very much, and welcome. Good afternoon. Well, it's afternoon here on the sunny Norfolk coast. No doubt spread different places and different time zones around the world. My name is Peter Carr. I've got over 35 years experience in the construction and property industry, but the last 15 years has been specifically on the accessible side. In 2008, I was invited to join an advisory panel for the 2012 Olympics, so that we could make sure that we were really pushing the boundaries up in terms of accessibility, inclusivity, and everything else like that. And I've carried on that involvement into other sectors, including stadium design, housing design, and still working on the Olympic Park to try and include as much real accessible design as we possibly can. We all talk about inclusive. It's a great word. So I thought I'll have a look into the dictionary and see what the definition is. There's a wonderful long-winded one, which I will read, which is aiming to include and interrogate all people and groups in activities, organisations, political processes, etc., especially those who are disadvantaged, have suffered discrimination, or are living with disabilities. Now, typical academic speak, it's a lot of words, and what does it really mean? I looked further down the page and found a far better definition, which was simply embracing. To my mind, that's what the whole inclusive design element is. It's embracing issues that everybody has And it's not just down to the visible disabilities and things like that. It's down to so many issues that people have to try and make their world as inclusive as possible. As I say, I've worked in the UK and also with some projects in Kenya as well. And I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of how I see inclusive design really working. The first example is a school that we developed in the Olympic Park. Unfortunately, the school grounds were on two levels. The upper level where the school buildings were, and then there was a lower level where the school playground was. And to access the school playground was this great wide steps that led down to the playground. And the steps could be used also in a way like an outside auditorium as well. So the designers also put in a ramp to allow people with wheelchairs and mobility issues to get down to that. The start of the ramp was at the same point as the start of the steps. The end of the ramp was the complete opposite end of the playground. Now, what this meant is that somebody who was using the ramp went onto the ramp with where everybody else was going down the steps. So it was pretty obvious they were having to go a different route. And then when they were discharged from the ramp, it was completely away from where everybody else was. Surely a far simpler solution was to put in a ramp that picked people up where the steps started and then discharged them from the ramp where the steps finished, so that everybody's arriving at their destination together. The other thing, this was a primary school, and rather than just having a straight, boring ramp, why not make it bendy and twisty and have different colors in it and different things to happen as you go down that ramp? Because then what might happen is that some of the able-bodied kids would come down that ramp as well. Make it fun, make it inclusive for everybody. And it also makes everybody want to use the things together, irrespective of what their issues are in terms of mobility and things like that. The second example was in Kenya. The photo on the screen shows the office door on a school in Kenya that I've been involved with. As you can see, it's totally accessible and really good in the top quality of design that's available in construction. We had a young chap there who was unable to walk at all. When he was first went to school, he was 6 years old. And so he was put into the nursery group, and his mum would take him to school in a wheelbarrow and lift him out of the wheelbarrow and sit him in the corner of the classroom, where he would then stay for the whole day until his mum came to pick him up from school, put him back in the wheelbarrow and took him home. So first thing we did in conjunction with the Walkabout Foundation is that we took out to Kenya 200 wheelchairs. This chap got a wheelchair, one of the pediatric ones. Suddenly he was mobile and he could move around. The only problem is that the only classroom he could still get into was the nursery classroom. And this guy was now 10, 11. So really, did he want to be in a classroom with other 6-year-olds? Was his education help him be in a classroom with 6-year-olds? So in one part, we'd solved his mobility problems and dealt with the inclusive part, but then we've created a bigger problem. However, this was solved by the British Army, who had a base nearby. We borrowed a couple of the guys from there who came armed with woodworking equipment and basically made the door to the other classrooms that bit wider so his wheelchair would fit through it. So the reason I brought this one up is that it's not always about putting big fancy ramps in. It's not always about putting lifts in and everything else like that. This was a simple solution to a relatively simple problem. And I think sometimes designers, especially in this country, and also owners of properties and things like that, see what's impressed upon them by the accessibility regulations to it suddenly being expensive things. It's not. It's simply about application. The whole thing, I think, is it's about looking at needs, that somebody wants to be part of it. It's about the environment, both physical and also the social environment as well. And then the application, it's making the application relevant, making it efficient, making it economic, and also having the minimal impact. So it's not something that stares you in the face. I think what we have to look at is that the main thing with inclusive design is for it to make a difference. Ideally, it wants to make everybody feel the same as everybody else. So no, you don't want to have to go into a door, a separate door, or a separate entrance simply because you're in a wheelchair. It's trying to make it, as the word says, inclusive. But the harder part, I think, is including it into the design process. We have designers who have a very broad spectrum of knowledge of what they're actually designing, but often with very little knowledge about what actually makes something inclusive. There are legal requirements, as in the building regulations in the UK and things like that, but they are the bare minimum standards. And is that really what we should be doing, providing the bare minimum? Can we not just up the game a bit more? There's this specific knowledge, as I said, as to what's needed in accessibility in terms of how do doorways work better for people. Is it better to have a sliding door rather than a normal hinge door for somebody in a wheelchair? How do we deal with wayfinding with people with sight issues? Again, we often get the conflict between tools that are put in place to deal with sight issues, such as tactile paving, which to somebody in a wheelchair is the worst thing ever. And it's balancing out some of these conflicts to make it right. One of the things that I've certainly found and continue to work with in making this actually happen are some of the advisory panels that have been set up. As Ian said, with the 2012 London Olympics and Paralympics, the Built Environment Access Panel was set up. This was a group of people with specific knowledge, experience, who could add into the design process for both the new buildings, the temporary buildings, and the existing buildings. This wasn't to try and take the place of the specific access consultants that the various design teams had on board. This was really to sort of say, from a client point of view, we just want to interrogate what you're saying, what you're putting forward. Not saying it's wrong, but trying to see that it's going to work, that it is going to enhance the situation. Also being able to throw in some improvements and things like that. So I think these panels are very important. Again, it's not having a panel that's too big, having a panel that has the right experience and can work. This was also something I set up when I was involved with Tottenham Hotspur's new stadium, where we set up a pan disability inclusion design group. As a result, I think the new Tottenham Stadium is probably, no, not probably, is the best new stadium in Europe, and especially in terms of accessibility. So really, I think it's, when I look at the next steps of where we need to get to, I think the big thing is about raising the bar. It's something we did in the days of the Olympics. When we looked at the Paralympics and the Olympic, their minimum standards, we didn't come anywhere close to that. We went further than that. So to my mind, it's about the minimum standards are there, but they're not good enough. It's having realistic expectations, and then it's about implementing it now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I mean, there's a couple of elements that came across really strongly from your overview, Peter, is that importance of embracing, but also adopting. And I guess that that will across designers and across planners and across really anyone involved in these large development infrastructure projects to get the right people in from the off and to make the decision to do that in an inclusive way. And I really liked your example from Tottenham's new stadium and how kind of your involvement and a wider group of other advisors has enabled some real success stories in that. And I think also that you've really highlighted there that sometimes it is simple solutions and it's about about doing things efficiently and doing them correctly from the off that can make the biggest difference. So I'm now just going to hand across to my colleague, Michaela, who's going to talk about a little bit more about our AT 2030 programme.
All right, hi everybody. I'm Michaela and I'm an inclusive design researcher with GDI Hub. I'm the research lead on our AT 2030 sub-programme that is looking at inclusive design and accessible environments in lower middle income countries. I'm going to talk a bit about the rationale behind this research, give you an overview of what we're doing in this sub-programme, and also introduce our first case study on Mongolia, which has been published today. Next slide, please. So why are we looking at inclusive design and the built environment as part of the AT 2030 programme on assistive technology? I think as this image shows, assistive technology users also need inclusive and accessible infrastructure to enable access and participation in society and the built environment. You can see in this image how there are obvious accessibility challenges in the road infrastructure in Mongolia. Next slide, please. So in lower middle income countries, the great need for infrastructure development, such as providing basic access to water, sanitation, or electricity, can mean that accessibility can be an afterthought. But we think that inclusive design can help address that accessibility gap. But at the moment, current knowledge and initiatives focus a lot on physical accessibility, such as steps and ramps. Inclusive design has the ability to do more, to go beyond the minimum standards. It's also not clear how much people understand about inclusive design approaches around the world, or how much knowledge they have on how to implement inclusive design. But we think that there is a huge opportunity to drive disability inclusion by embedding inclusive design into infrastructure development. Next slide, please. So our research will look to address some of these points through a series of case studies. Over 3 years, we'll be working in 6 cities in 6 different countries, all in lower and middle income settings. And we'll be looking to pick out common themes and global actions so that we can build a picture of what inclusive design looks like in different places in the world. This is because we think inclusive design should respond to diverse contexts. Inclusive design should respond to culture, geography, climate, and resources. And we want to work closely with local partners, particularly disabled persons organisations in each country, to make sure that we are working with local knowledge and expertise. We have case studies planned in India, Kenya, Sierra Leone, and Indonesia. And we are here today to talk about our first case study in Mongolia. Next slide, please. So we've been working in Mongolia for the last 4 months with our research partners, IFO, an Italian NGO based in Mongolia since the 1990s, and Technigem and Universal Progress ILC, who are both disabled persons organisations. We wanted to understand the current state of accessibility in the built environment in the capital city of Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar, including what barriers people face and what opportunities there are for inclusive design. To do this, we've conducted research with 3 major stakeholder groups: government stakeholders who have decision-making power, industry stakeholders who play a role in shaping and designing the built environment, and community stakeholders who are the people that are living in the city every day. The report has launched today, and it covers lessons learned and recommended actions. And we hope it also captures the experiences of our research participants and their vision for a more inclusive city. On the images on the left, you can just see a snapshot of some of the activities we conducted, which included a mixture of remote and in-person research activities. Next slide, please. So before I hand over to our research partners in Mongolia, I just wanted to share 2 images from our research participants' photo diaries. These diaries were used to document how our participants move around the city, where they experience challenges to accessibility, and where they like to spend their time. In the image on the left, our participant wanted to show how they feel stigma in the built environment, highlighting how awareness raising and a culture of inclusion is so important for inclusive design. In the image on the right, our participant is showing how the poor state of infrastructure, in this case roads and paving, is creating a barrier for both accessibility and assistive technology use. The image also shows how infrastructure and the built environment in accessibility is also impacted by climate. Mongolia has an extreme climate, and in the winter, snow and ice, and in the summer, heavy rain, create slippery surfaces and obscure things like potholes, which creates obstacles for people navigating the city and can also damage assistive technology, causing AT to require more frequent maintenance or replacement. And I'll now hand over to our team in Mongolia, who want to talk a bit more about the accessibility challenges in Ulaanbaatar and also their work. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Michaela. And I think it's really exciting today to be launching the first of the 6 case studies and to really see the breadth and the range of countries that are going to be explored in the future. And I think what's particularly interesting is that the information and the research and the findings from this is from that range of government, industry and community stakeholders, and the breadth of knowledge that comes from engaging with all those different parties within these reports. So we'll now hear from our Mongolian partners. I'll leave them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit more about their work.
Just a second.
No problem. I think they're just setting up their screens and their microphones. So when you're ready, if you can unmute your microphones and pop on your cameras, and we really look forward to hearing a bit more about your program.
Yeah, okay. Sorry.
There's no problem at all.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much. My name is Tamir, and his name is my colleague Nyapka. And first of all, we would like to thank GDI Hub and IFO, Italian NGO, and Technigum. And today I'm going to introduce about our research, which has done past 4 months. Please, next slide. Accessibility barriers in Ulaanbaatar. First of all, city was planned without including persons with disabilities issues from the beginning. And also policymakers have no understanding about the inclusive design. Their attitude towards disability are mostly based on the medical model. And due to those reasons, the physical condition of built environment is one of the main barriers for people with disabilities in the society. Please, next slide. The research on inclusive design. The lack of relationship between different government agencies and organizations for law and policies. For example, we have different sectors and with different laws, but those laws, policies are not related to each other. So that was the one problem, and we have seen some advantage during the research. The government, most of stakeholders are engaged in the last, at least some plans to create a more accessible city. For example, in Mongolia, we are going to have law on accessibility soon. So it shows that the awareness of people are getting better and better. So people are realizing that inclusive is not just for people with disabilities. It is also for everyone. Please, next slide.
Okay.
Here's about universal progress.
Okay, thank you. Universal Progress Independent Living Center is the first independent living center in Mongolia and founded 10 years ago. It has over 140 members with the different type of disabilities. Our purpose is to change public awareness of disability from the medical model to society model, and advocate for the independent living concept, and to empower people with the disability, and to create a more inclusive society. Next slide, please. And I'm working as an accessibility assessor. My main duty is first assessing the built environment, for example, toilets, ramps, and spaces, stairs, etc., etc. And second, consult and give a recommendation on the accessibility to companies and organizations. Third, drawing engineering drawings for accessibility to the companies and organizations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's fantastic to hear from our Mongolian colleagues there about some of the work they've been doing, and just to understand the context to, I guess, this case study and the wider environment in Mongolia currently around quite a low understanding of inclusive design, but actually the awareness is increasing, and actually through programs like this and through other work happening on the ground, there's some real strides being made, and people are recognizing further the importance of these areas, and that actually all of this work will really help build that and build momentum around inclusive design, particularly in these areas where it's so important and so valuable. So I will now hand across to our colleague Nina from Kota Kita. I'll leave you, Nina, to introduce yourself a little bit more and tell us all a little bit around some of the work that's currently happening in Indonesia. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nina from Kota Kita. Kota Kita is a non-profit organization based in Indonesia with expertise in urban planning and then citizen participations. And then we're working in the design and development of the cities. We work in more than 20 cities in Indonesia, focusing more on governance and climate change resilience and then inclusivity. But in this session, I want to explore more about our works in inclusivity in the city of Banjarmasin, Indonesia. Next slide, please. Okay, so just asking like why inclusivity? Because, you know, like we believe that our works that everyone should have access to and opportunities to reach their potential to the fullest, because many times people are left behind in the city making process. So not everyone getting their opportunities to live in enjoyable cities. But then our research found that there are still some barriers to meaningful participation for the persons with disabilities in Indonesia. The first one is the policy language is not translated into operational words on the ground, making the city's implementation facing the inconsistency in the local context, because most of the time it depends on the political will and the commitment of the ruling government. And then the second one, furthermore, like there is no segregated data on disability with figures varying across the official agencies. You know, like the poor data documentation resulting in missing opportunities for disabled people in the cities, like social assistance, political participation, and many more. And then the third one is the connectivity of accessible public infrastructure is fragmented and often piecemeal, because in many cities we can see the inclusive design limited only for the visibility in the city center, but left behind the disabled people who are living in the heart of the cities. And then the fourth one is the implementation of accessibility measures often fall short of universal design standards. Like, for example, like you see in the pictures, like there is a need from the city to provide a guiding block for the persons with visual impairment, but then it hits the trees and then across to the river, which is more dangerous for the persons with disability living in the cities. Next slide, please. So like Kota Kita has been working on the inclusive effort to support the cities, providing a more safe environment and inclusive for the persons with disabilities and the vulnerable group. Like, but then like in Indonesia, disability data often outdated to be useful for the effective planning and the policy making. That's why like we are concentrated on the more inclusive data collection, utilizing the technology-based data collection with participatory approach. Kota Kita has been realizing to implement the data collection in the city of Banjarmasin has resulted to map 3,897 persons with disabilities living in the 1,600 more blocks in the cities. So by doing so, it resulted in twice of the numbers from the official government data. And then our finding has breached a more inclusive planning process. And then visioning the inclusive city, we need to recognize that the power dynamics in the community. Next slide, please. The next slide, yeah. The vision and inclusive city is very important to recognizing also the power dynamics in the community, because the persons with disabilities and the elderly are left behind in the policymaking process. So in our 80-20-30 research program with the UCL and then SLARC, we try to engage more with the persons with disabilities and then the elderly to build the creative inclusive space for the articulation of ideas and aspiration, ensuring no one left behind, to create the more efficient for a more inclusive cities. Next. And then taking more our commitment in providing the inclusive environment in the mobility for all, because we realized that 45% of the persons with disabilities in the city of Banjarmasin never travel, like they never left their home. So in the picture, we can see like, what if we build the world that accessible for all, like not only providing access for the personal assistive technology like a wheelchair. Imagine like the person in the center, like he modified his motorcycle so that he can get to work and then take his family. But then again, what if we do more? Like we collaborate with GIZ and then the first motorcycle, the three-wheelers taxi drivers in Indonesia called Diva Bike. And then we also join with the university design team to collaborate into the three-wheelers that allowing persons with disabilities becoming the driver, and then also create this, the inclusive environment system that allowing them to take more persons with disabilities into the accessibility. So last words, like imagine what we do together, like something even from the small effort to create a better city, like a city for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nina. I think it's really fascinating just to understand all the different elements at play, I guess, from the challenge of a lack of data through to policy language and the implementation of that policy on the ground, and then the impact of politics, and also the area that you mentioned that I think comes up quite regularly is around the fragmented infrastructure and the challenges of different parts of the city and design being implemented in different ways in different areas. So I think that all really highlights some of the real challenges of inclusive design, but also some of the potential. And she said at the end there that the volume of people, particularly within your example there, that actually aren't moving beyond their immediate area and aren't traveling, and actually the impact that inclusive design and infrastructure based around inclusive design could make, not only to those people's lives, but also to the economy and to education and to all the different areas that then also feed off of that. So I'll probably just quickly hand back to my colleague Ian, just to give a little bit of a summary, I guess, of what we've heard today, and I guess what you think the priorities are moving forward, Ian.
Thank you, Louise. Yeah, so thank you to everyone for taking the time to speak today. It's been great, and I hope all the attendees have found it really interesting and helpful. And also thanks for the questions that have been coming through. I've been doing my bit to answer some of those. In terms of priorities, I would probably reflect what some of the questions and comments that have been made pick up on. I always think about priorities in the kind of the short term, but then also in the long term. For me, the long-term priority is about kind of really good education and training. I've said that for a while now, and I believe it's it's true. We want to get to the point where I would hope that kind of, as I said in my introduction, those designers and decision makers coming into the industry really understand and have had at least some grounding in inclusive design and the principles and the methodology and the mindset that influences their work when they kind of grow into their respective industries. But I appreciate that as a long-term goal, and will take, you know, significant kind of resource and energy to get going. And we're doing a bit on that in terms of both on the academic side and on the education, and also on training. You know, short term, I think it's there is also a need for kind of better understanding. I think where things fall down often is implementation. That's something that Michaela has found that's come through our research work so far, as even in places where maybe good policy exists, or even in some cases good standards exist, the mechanisms for really then implementing that fall down. So for me, those are two kind of key points that I would make, both short term and then also thinking more long term.
Thank you, Ian. And as you said, we've had quite a few questions, I think, come through on the chat box and also the Q&A, just asking around how can companies really understand the value of audits. And I think that probably spreads beyond companies and to policymakers and obviously designers and I guess all the different other stakeholders are also involved in this process. And also quite a few questions around that idea that actually there are very strong and very good kind of examples of good practice and guidance and guidelines, but how can they be best adopted? So I think it'd be quite good to come to you, Peter, just to hear about what you think are the biggest challenges and what might be the best mechanisms to overcome some of those, just to start to see how some of these areas can be implemented.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I think a huge part of it is education, both professionally and socially. I'm never convinced that, certainly in the UK, the big educational arms such as the RIBA, the RICS, the ICE, really include inclusive design as a serious part of their development and training of staff. And when you also look at, because all the professional bodies now have this continual professional development element that's part of their requirement to keep your qualification, again, a lot of that centers around other issues, and very little actually comes through on inclusive design. So I think there's obviously the main education part that is vital. And then I think it is then with owners, clients, that sort of thing, that they understand that it doesn't have to be expensive. I think there's a view, and certainly when the DDA rules first came in the UK and in the US, there was this great fear that, oh, we're going to spend thousands putting lifts in and changing this and changing that. It doesn't have to be expensive. It just takes a bit of thought and a bit of application. Yeah, sometimes it's thinking outside the box, but it's just really trying some things and seeing what's right. But if you could do that in conjunction with a team such as the advisory panels that we set up, that will make a huge difference, and it makes it very relevant as well.
Thank you, Peter. So I think it would be really interesting then just to hear how that then applies on a more global scale. So I guess from the team in Mongolia, maybe we'll come to you and just find out what you think you would say are the biggest challenges from a local level, I guess, particularly based around the case study, but actually whether they very much apply on the national scale and how you might see the mechanisms to start overcoming some of those.
About the problem is that people awareness of the disability is one of the big issue was for the inclusive accessibility, and also the legislation is also another problem, because in our regulation there's one regulation, but they don't cannot be used for every place. It just can be followed or unfollowed. It's up to them who are going to build the buildings or roads, anything. So the regulation and awareness of the disability or accessibility is the one key issue was for the when we were doing the research.
And just to add on that, I could include an example we found in the case study. So one of the big barriers to implementing inclusive design we found in Mongolia is that the current process through which buildings are approved means that buildings are only assessed by people with disabilities once the building has already been built. A building design goes through 2 stages of approval, one at a kind of planning stage before it's built and one post-construction. But people with disabilities are only assessing the building once it's already built, which means that it's more expensive and more difficult to make those changes. If you can change the system and embed inclusive design and accessibility measures from the beginning, you'll have a much better design and much better process as well of embedding inclusive design.
Thank you, Michaela. That's really interesting, and I think what comes up from your response there, and also from the team in Mongolia, and I think it's something that's echoed in the Q&A box, that quite a few people have been asking around that challenge of I guess the enforcement of this and the challenges around the end users really only being considered at the very end of the process once buildings have been developed. So not getting that diverse input from the off, and actually some of the challenges around that have been mentioned in the Q&A are around developers and the relationship between developers and designers, and where sometimes inclusive design just doesn't hit their radar until much later on in the process. So I think it would be really interesting, Nina, just to hear from you around if it's similar challenges as we've heard from Mongolia and Indonesia around the end users and the kind of diverse input not happening until later, and whether you'd also see education and cost as being a real challenge in implementation.
Yeah, so like in Indonesia, like cities are like towards like progressively consulting with the representative from the persons with disabilities organizations, but then again in the construction process they haven't been involved directly to the process, so that after the evaluation it still hasn't met the standard of the universal design. For most of the time the constructions technicians and everyone think that the accessories of the inclusive design in the universal design is only like accessories that visible, like the guiding block is only like the yellow stripes in the street, something like that. So even though like the ramp is already provided, it's usually not accessible. So this is very dangerous situations in the cities of Indonesia, because if one designers and then all these people, all these stakeholders haven't been collaborated from the policymaking process through the implementations, like there is a missing dots there, it's going to be really hard to establish the inclusive cities. So it needs like a more careful consideration and then very attentive attentions like from each one of the stakeholders to involve everyone in the tables, like to share what's needed to be done, and then to follow up again with the monitoring process until it's established the good one, the accessible one, because it's going to be like wasted money if you provided all the guiding block and then RAM isn't accessible. You know, like we think like the first thing to be done by the government, all the stakeholders in the city, is like the mapping of the disability, because you know, like if you just provided the ramp, but what if like the persons in the city is like having, you know, physical disabilities or something like that, or this is not something they want to be accommodated their needs, like, you know, like you should consult with them like from the policy planning process and then involving them to the end. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. We've also actually, just while you're here, we've also had a question come through in the chat box around how you went about the mapping process, and people were saying it's a really interesting area of work. So I don't know whether that's something you can just provide a very short summary of how you went about it.
So yeah, we did like a participatory data collections for disability in 2 cities in Indonesia, in our best office in Surakarta or Solo, and then one city it's the one that I presented to you is the city of Banjarmasin. So it's 2 is in the different province, one is in Java and one is Kalimantan. To process is involving like the volunteers. It can be contextualized with the agency of the citizens. Like in Solo, we addressing more the volunteers from the mothers and then the youth. But in Banjarmasin, we ask the volunteers from the university students who have been familiarized with data collection process. So we give them like the training using the data collection, using the technology like a Kobo collect or Odika collect, because we realize that the poor data collection usually using the manual data collection, and then at the end it's resulting into data entry error. That's why we use like a simple Kobo collect and then the Odika collect, and then we explored the question from the Washington group question to assess the disability aspects. And then before going to that, we also collected the secondary data from the official government offices like Department of Social. So we gathered all this list of the persons with disabilities in the cities, but then we compared them to going to one like a census, like door-to-door interviews, like having disabilities. And also we equipped them more with the questions related to the accessibility, including like the ownership of the assistive technology, something like that. So first of all, we are always using the baseline information to set the guideline first, and then we train the data collectors to be more.
Fantastic. It's really interesting just getting a bit more of an understanding of how that process works. We've had another question come up that I believe has been answered in the chat, but I think it would be quite good just to answer it on the verbally as well. So we had a question come in from an architect working on large scale projects, both in the public and the private sector. And just, I guess, asking for a bit of insight on how's the best way to create kind of positive progress, and how architects should look to access client side and users and make sure they get that diverse input. So I think, Peter, we'll maybe come to you just to give a bit of an overview of what would you say the priorities are from an architect's perspective, for example, starting out on a big project, and how some of these challenges can be overcome.
Yeah, it is difficult, but I think the biggest thing is to make it part of the project right from the very start. I mean, you look at most project developments and the whole concept of inclusive design doesn't come through until quite a long way down the line, usually the sort of detailed design element. To my mind, it should be in the initial feasibility study, so that it can be addressed by the architects, by engineers, and by the cost consultants. So you're sure the cost of providing this is there from day one. It's also being part of the project brief. I mean, especially from educated clients. I spent a lot of time working in the university sector. We were a big client at one point, and it's important that clients such as that, say, where you have qualified people in your team, do actually put forward and say, yes, we want a building that's aesthetically works right, that meets these functional requirements, as well as being properly inclusive. And it's not just the minimum of what the building regulations wants. It's taking it a bit further and just making it part of the design. If you look around, there's some beautiful architectural designs for access and things like that that have been done so well and make an architectural statement. It doesn't have to be fairly sort of institutionalized or anything like that. I've done a number of domestic projects, for example, where there's only been one grab handle in the whole house. Everything else works for the person in that house, but other people live in the house, and it's not just, so it's designed around the person with the mobility or any other impairment that other people live there. So design can be done. It can be done in a very, very tasteful way. Another classic example is wet rooms. You can do a really nice, very attractive wet room that anybody would want in their house, rather than doing something that's got brown grab handles here, there, and everywhere and looks like a care home.
Oh.
Sorry,
having trouble turning on my video then.
Sorry, but no, going back, it's a big education process. I think we do, certainly in the UK, we need to get into people like the RIBA so they can start pushing it. The same in the US, and the same around the world. I know that again through the Kenyan process of employing architects and that architectural education, there's a big education process to go with that, and I think it's actually getting programs out there, especially through online education processes and such like, to really push it and make it a very vital part of a designer's education. It's not just architects, it's engineers, it's interior designers, it's shop designers, office designers, the whole lot, really to make it inclusive, because if one designer can't necessarily solve the problem, it could be solved by somebody else. Absolutely. So it's looking at it, and that also helps to improve the social inclusivity as well, which I think is as vital a part.
And I think what's really interesting, and I think that's come up through this discussion, but also through all the presentations, is that balance between culture and education and practice and policy, and how they all kind of intertwine and are all really valuable within this discussion. So Ian, I'll maybe hand across to you. I'm aware we're coming towards the end of the session, so it'd be really good just to hear any final reflections you have on what's been discussed, or what you think people should take as a going away points around inclusive design and the priorities moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. I think it's been really good conversation, good questions. And I suppose it's one of those ones where you feel kind of assured or reassured that, because a lot of the questions that are being asked are questions we ask ourselves, and is highlighting things that we are discovering and through our research. So, but then on the other hand, these are the key challenges that we really face, that we really want to kind of really tackle and help solve, really, I guess, and challenge. We've reflections for me. We've spoken a fair bit about education. That's clearly very important across the board. We've spoken a bit about implementation and not just having the policy and the regulations and the guidance in place, but how that's then implemented. We've spoken a bit about the importance of genuinely involving disabled people from the very start of the process. Getting in there at the start of a project, as Peter just said, as has been reflected elsewhere, is vital. And if you can cost it from the start of a project, your budget profile might change, but I am of the school of thought that your overall budget doesn't necessarily need to. The profile will, perhaps, yes. Obviously, it's not on a case-by-case basis, but I think you do it early, you embed it from the project brief. And I'm of the opinion there's no real excuse for not doing it. There's always a way to do it and achieve an end result that, as I said at the start, gives this positive experience to people. It's about your experience of using a building, a place, the world around you. You're creating positive experiences for everybody. That's what's important to me.
Thank you very much, Ian. So I'm just going to quickly finish off with updating on our next webinar. So let me just get this on my screen. First of all, our Mongolia case study, as has been mentioned, is launching today. It's available on our AT 2030 website, and it's a really interesting document. Lots and lots of detail, a lot more depth around some of the areas that have been discussed today, and some real highlights around priorities moving forward and implementation. Our next Disability Innovation Live session will be looking at country capacity investments. So that's really looking at how we can support country governments globally to address AT access. So that's highlighting where the challenges are and how some of those can be addressed to really get AT to people that need it on a global scale. So that session will be on the 19th of November. So we'll be sharing some more detail around that. And I've also noticed throughout the chat today, there's been quite a lot of people asking for some more information on some of the upcoming case studies around inclusive design that were mentioned by Michaela at the start. So we'll share some more information on that work to everyone that signed up to this session, and also the links when they're live to the transcript and the recording so that you can come back and watch again, but also find out a bit more about what the next steps are in these case studies so that you can get involved as well. And I guess I also just wanted to mention that the Global Disability Innovation Hub delivers our own MSc in Disability Design and Innovation. And as part of that, Ian, who's been kind of leading some of the discussion today, has a module itself on inclusive design. And for us, it's really important, actually, that education element. So I just wanted to highlight that, actually, that's something that we've developed our own kind of MSc program to really build in inclusive design to the learning and to the creation of kind of the next generation of pioneers within disability innovation. So that's all from Disability Innovation Live today. Thank you so much for joining. A huge thank you to all the panelists that have joined the session today and talked so much about kind of the work they're doing.